Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. It is good to be with you today. I'm honored, as always, to have our guest, Abdaljawad Omar, back on the platform. I know we just had him last week, but kind of a lot has happened since then. And it may be a little bit before we're able to get him back on. So I was, you know, grateful to have him take up the invitation to talk to us about what the heck is going on? Because there's a lot that's going on that we need to discuss and talk about. And so, folks who don't know, Abdul Jawad Omar is a Palestinian scholar, educator, and theorist whose work focuses on the politics of resistance, decolonization, and the Palestinian struggle. He has written extensively in Arabic, and at this point, I would say he's written quite extensively in English. Frequent collaborator here, Electronic Intifada, Ebb Magazine, a lot of work for Mondo Weiss, and also now has a column with communists, which we'll let him kind of say a little bit more about. We did a discussion about some of his pieces there about a month ago, but he's continuing to write there. And so Abdul Jawad, it's good to be with you again.
It's good to be with you as well, Jared. How you doing?
Good. How are you?
I'm good.
All right,
Surviving.
so let's just let's start with the ceasefire. And the last conversation we had with you was on October 7th with Lara, and you spoke a little bit about it, about the conditions which might be leading to a ceasefire, but obviously there's been quite a lot that's happened since then, in terms of things, I guess, that make this time a little bit different than the other ceasefires that we've seen, which doesn't necessarily mean that it will hold. But obviously, we're seeing Trump come in a particular way, and some differences also, I think, between how the Israeli government is responding. Excuse me. So why don't we start there?
Well, I think I tried to outline a bit the last time the various factors that is going into this new form of agreement, which includes a 20-point plan, kind of divided within phases, which was propelled, if you want, by like three factors together. First of all, the slowness of the Israeli genocidal machine, meaning that its inability to really truly finish the job in the sense of ethnically cleansing the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip in a rapid and fast manner. So that played into this, of course. The second, of course, is Israel's transgressions that reached and culminated also in its attack on Qatar, which kind of propelled the reaction from the Arab world, at least one that we didn't necessarily see out in public, but it seems that it led to a lot of pressure on the American administration to start rolling the war down and start tempering, the pace of the genocide. And of course, because of business interests, because of Gulf countries' role in also the American economy and the petrodollar scheme that has been going on for at least 70 or so years, where America provisions some sort of military protection between quotes. And of course, in return, these Gulf countries also reinvest a lot of their petrodollars in European and American economy. So you had also, like, within that arrangement, something that also the Americans take into account. And of course, managing its own imperial relations in the region, that include, for instance, managing this kind of right-wing fascist government in Israel that wants to eradicate the Palestinians in a way on the expense of the Arab countries surrounding it, specifically Egypt and Jordan. And in the context of Qatar, even going as far as, striking Qatar without even trying to do it in a much more clandestine, less, if you want, obvious manner, at least attempting assassination. I think that also propelled at least some sort of diplomatic movements to try and reach an agreement. And the third, I think, which is also important in all of this, not only the temporal slowness of the genocide, and not only this management between Israel and the Arab countries, America's allies, managing their interests in the region, is the desire among many of those who stand in the right on the side of America specifically, to start articulating a grammar of a post-war world, specifically as Israel, in relative terms, was successful in pushing back against the resistance axis, weakening, for instance, Hezbollah, placing Hamas also in in a weakened state, with much of its leadership, also specifically the leadership in the Gaza Strip, killed or assassinated in the past 2 years, and of course much of its also firepower, etc., been consumed within the current war. So there's a desire to move from this paradigm where force is not really necessarily bringing about different results than everyday moves, is not necessarily making anything look much different or radically different than the day before, and move into some sort of political arrangement. And one of the things that we can start to notice is that, of course, first, the idea that still within the paradigm of the post-October 7th world, there's something similar to the one that preceded the October 7th, is that what we see is generally agreements, promises, plans that are devised and designed in the White House or in Westminster, of course, in the heyday of the British Empire, and then then these powers tried to impose them on the region one way or the other. The second thing that we can notice about these ceasefire agreements, that it's still like we're still in this kind of asymmetric, skewed, where the words on text are generally devised by Western powers, and specifically in this context, Israel and the U.S. And of course, even what we know about this 20-point plan is that it was devised by the Arabs and Trump, then changed radically by the Israelis before it was adopted by Trump and Netanyahu in the White House press conference that they held together, and then, of course, presented to the resistance movements, Hamas, that agreed to it in this kind of sophisticated way that we talked about also last time. So we're still living in that moment where, agreements, plans are basically designed by the empire itself rather than by the peoples that live in the region. The second thing that we can notice about the agreement is that, or the ceasefire agreement, whether it's in Lebanon or in Gaza, is that there's a threshold of non-surrender among the resistance forces, but at the same time, resistance forces are in a weakened state. So what does that mean? Is that they are accepting agreements that are hard to accept, but at the same time, they're agreements that they can still live with. And this applies to Hezbollah in Lebanon, for instance, where the agreement basically allowed Israel some sort of freedom of movement to still attack Lebanon, to assassinate cadres from Hezbollah, specifically south of what is called the Litani River, to create the conditions for sustained pressure in terms of course, it's within the agreement. There are violations, but in the spirit, it's still moving in that direction. And at the same time, with the current agreement between the resistance forces in Gaza and Israel, while perhaps the war as we knew it has ended, of course, this is still a question. It does and will still not necessarily lead to any form of peace. What will happen now is that we will have either something like the Lebanon model, and in terms of how the Israelis also killed 2 people in Gaza yesterday, I think 9. So they're still violating, they're still killing people, but at the same time, in a much lesser rate, I guess. And at the same time, still aid is not trickling in the way it should. Rafah has not opened, and of course, rebuilding is still very far away, and reconstruction is really far away from the current moment that we're in. So we're also in this kind of phase, whether in Lebanon, even in Syria with the current new regime, that is trying to also find or figure some sort of arrangement with the Israelis, whether it's in Gaza, where the language of violence remains prevalent, and at the same time, there is some movement towards what it means to live in a post-October 7th interval or moment. And I think this is where things could always go from, a fragile forms of ceasefire to basically accepting that these fragile forms of ceasefire become some sort of permanent condition, or that the ingredients within the agreements and the way and the actors are interacting on the ground create the conditions for the next round of fighting. And that applies to Lebanon, for instance, where the demand from the Israelis and Americans of Hezbollah giving up its weapons will probably be met by the negative, while still Hezbollah not engaging in a war with Israel. So how will that be solved is a question to be opened. Will it be solved through a civil war in Lebanon itself? Will it be solved through Israeli launching a new war? Or will it be solved actually by Hezbollah taking the initiative and, of course, trying to change the equation and return to a form of deterrence if they're capable of doing that by taking the initiative and, of course, responding to Israeli violations of the ceasefire in Lebanon. The same thing goes for Gaza. Now that you have given up much of the prisoners that the Palestinian resistance had, specifically at least the 20 Israeli prisoners that were alive, and you had a prisoners exchange that was not necessarily the most, at least from a Palestinian perspective, was not necessarily the most what people hoped for. They hoped for a much larger number of people that included a lot of the leadership, etc. But despite that, since the war, at least, and the massacres ended and the wholesale destruction of Gaza has ceased, most Palestinians understand that this is the agreement that can now be salvaged, at least for the moment. It still applies to Gaza. Is the right wing really defeated in its project to ethnic cleanse and decisively end the question of Palestine? Or is it just a period of rest before they launch another war or another intense campaign? These are questions that are still open. And I think from the perspective, at least, of the Palestinian resistance, reaching this agreement, doing the prisoners exchange, having an agreement that speaks about Palestinians remaining in Gaza, reconstruction in Gaza, creation of the conditions for the return of those stuck outside of Gaza in Egypt and other countries who wish to return to Gaza, or those who wish to leave. So there's a lot in the agreement that at least on a humanitarian but also political level that is pertinent and relevant to the demands of the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip generally. But having said that, at the same time, the agreement does also have a lot of ambivalence about how it will move forward, what form of concessions are needed, whether the Palestinians in resistance will have to give up its weapons, whether the Israelis are now under strict orders not to actually relaunch the campaign, no matter what the context is. But I think within the cracks of the agreement, within its temporal space that opens, at least it will give the Palestinian resistance, specifically Hamas, a breathing space to first consolidate itself in the Gaza Strip, rearrange its leadership structure, having suffered also in the past 6 months of the assassination of field commanders, etc. And at the same time, provision the possibility of also defeating much of the gangs that actually existed in the Gaza Strip and were harassing people and creating a lot of problems, while at the same time opening the space where Israel's primary justification for the continuation of the war ends. So if it continues the war, that means it will also face even more of a moral and diplomatic crisis in terms of getting any form of legitimacy for the continuation of its campaign, and maneuvering itself, the Palestinian resistance maneuvering itself in a way that would permit it to maintain its presence and, of course, continue its capacity to resist through time without actually ceding complete control for the Israelis or for any other form of governance that will actually come and take over the Gaza Strip. So it gave the agreement in its design is still phased. There's still many details to agree on, but that tells us also at the same time it's very fragile. Like the context also in terms of the relationship between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, but also the context of Israel in relation with Iran, where they had a ceasefire, but the war could also be launched at any moment, at any specific time. So I think we're in a fragile phase. I'm not sure that the current agreement will guarantee an ability to move from, genocide, wholesale destruction and annihilation of the Palestinian people towards a grammar, a political grammar, of course, that is sponsored by the Arabs, the Americans. And in here, the Arabs, I mean the Arab countries that are already client states of the Americans as well. And at the same time, the Americans and the Israelis, who will try to create this kind of grand bargain. And of course, actually, in fact, save Israel from itself in many ways by doing so, or that the continuation of war will take different shapes and forms, maybe less intense, but will remain with us for a long time to come, or we'll return to a more intense forms of warfare in relation to Iran. Still, like what I'm trying to say is that we're still in a very uncertain and highly flux moment, and I think that the agreements have a lot of vulnerability for them to break down, and at the same time they have the ability to move into this form of consolidation depending. My analysis is that I don't think we will see consolidation in any of these arenas in a way that actually ends the question of the return to war in a meaningful way. I think the Israelis are interested in keeping the idea of war, even if they don't actually launch a war, but the idea of war or a different, much more or a low intensity form of warfare continuing that pressure without necessarily the backlash that they've been getting and isolation that has been growing with the more intense form of genocide that they have been committing. And at the same time, I think that also for the resistance forces, there is on some level an incentive to not move towards a paradigm where Israel is saved from itself in a way that would actually create the conditions for new normalization agreements, or create the condition for the sidestepping of the Palestinian question, for instance, in the context of Palestine, or that would force Hezbollah to relinquish its weapons in Lebanon and then move Lebanon into the domain of countries that normalize with Israel. So these are all, I think, questions that remain highly susceptible to the use of violence once again. But at the same time, both the right wing in Israel, I think, and on some level also the resistance forces will not want to move to that paradigm of post-war political arrangements. For the right wing, because one of the things that we should make really central in our discussion is that if this ceasefire holds, we are seeing also the defeat of Israel's right-wing messianic project to eliminate the Palestinians in a wholesale way. And that will create a crisis within the right wing in Israel. Crisis that I think where they promised a lot, they couldn't deliver. That's one element of that crisis, of course, to their own base. The second crisis is that how will Israel deal reflexively with the idea that it destroyed its own reputation, showed its true colors to the world, and at the same time eventually couldn't really decisively end the Palestinian question. Maybe it can speak of a sufficient victory for it to continue in the region, at least having used so much violence in the past 2 years, but it cannot speak of a total victory that the right wing was trying to actually elicit or at least reach in this current interval in the past 2 years. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for all of that. I think one question I have with this, and there's some good questions in the chat that we can pull up in a bit, but one question I have is, kind of how you read the role of Trump within all of this, specifically, not obviously as, a savior or anything like that. The question I'm more have is, he wanted to win the peace prize this past time. Of course, he didn't. The Venezuelan fascist Maria Machado won, but he wanted to win it and didn't. And as they do this piece, this pageantry that we saw on the 13th, where, he goes to the Knesset, he delivers, one speech there to the Israelis, um, very chummy speech, him making his shout outs to his big donor, big Zionist donor, Miriam Adelson, and, declares the war over, though, right? And I think then, goes to the summit in Egypt, right? And gives a slightly different speech, but also, around this idea. I think, he enjoyed being surrounded by all of these world leaders who were, praising him and, kind of beneath him in the hierarchy of the world, right? And declaring peace and, promoting himself as the peace president, which of course is ridiculous. I mean, currently he just yesterday they authorized officially, which I don't know why they publicly authorize CIA operations, because, normally they don't waste the time to announce that they're doing CIA operations in Venezuela. Um, but, you know, obviously there's, we can point out the hypocrisy, right, or whatever, of him claiming to be for peace. The point is that he's promoting that idea, and he's promoting that he's ended this war, which, I don't, obviously, if it doesn't end, right, if I don't, I take for granted that he and Netanyahu would blame the Palestinian resistance for, not disarming or not abiding by their part of the agreement or whatever, and use that as the pretext to return. But nonetheless, I think it still would be a bit of a kind of, egg on his face moment. It kind of, I think, would diminish um any attempt, although I don't know that it matters. I mean, I don't know that he cares that much about public perception, and I don't think this is overwhelmingly about individuals, right? It's about systems and much bigger relationships than that. But I wonder a little bit if you think that there's any pressure that Trump applies to Netanyahu to end now, or if it's actually quite the opposite, that, like, Israel needed a way to end this, and that, by bringing Trump in, I know that the resistance also wanted Trump to sign off on it, right, and to do these public displays to kind of put pressure on the Israelis. So I guess I'm just asking you, like, how do you read his role in all of this kind of pageantry that he's built around, ending this war, which obviously still has, as we've talked about, a number of unknowns, and I know we'll talk about more of them today, in terms of, you know, uh, all the ways that it could return to a hot war, or, a higher intensity, low intensity war, or whatever we want to call it. Yeah.
Well, I think, Jared, I mean, to be honest, I think, first of all, I mean, in Trump, we find, you know, one thing I would say immediately is that the theatrics of Trump are always interesting, because they reveal something deeper about the relationship between Israel and the US. For instance, in his speech in Knesset, one of the things that I think most people miss is that how small Israel looked. He made the Israelis feel very small, giving orders and requesting pardons, making the president of Israel stand up, telling Bibi that this agreement is good. And you can see, even Netanyahu's face turning very, turning very uncomfortable with the theatrics of an American president, both who stands with Israel and both who they think they can manipulate at the same time, but also coming in with this kind of theatrics of, hey, Israel, you need to understand your place in the world. Now, I'm not saying that this is the theatrics, that is genuine. I mean, maybe Trump is also, this is him. He's a narcissist. He thinks he's the center of the world, so it comes natural to him to do that. And at the same time, I think there is something around the rebellion of the right wing in the U.S., where playing into America first, Israel being a client state that needs to listen, is something that also Trump is performing for. And I think the third element to it, that I would say is that there is something around how the Americans, at least in relation to the Israelis at this current juncture, find themselves in a highly confused space. Even the political class itself. Like some year or so ago, I made that prophecy, which I think will probably be a mistake, which is that this is the last time you'll see Netanyahu in Congress, being so celebrated in many ways. That I don't know if you remember that. It was like last summer. And I still I'm not saying that we might not see another visit to Congress that would see his celebration, but I do think that something has really shifted, and that slowly and assuredly that there's a lot of much more burden among American politicians on how to deal with Israel, and Israel as a topic, and Israel as a policy. It doesn't mean that they're moving away from Israel as policymakers, but they are at least thinking much more about managing the public image around the relationship with Israel, just generally, AIPAC, Israel, etc., whether in the Democratic Party, but also in the Republican Party. So I think there are something along those lines where the theatrics of we're the boss comes forward, at least in Trump. And really, Israel looked very small. It looked like a small colony taking orders from the emperor who's descending on it and making fun of it and making everybody look like a fool, and them just laughing and clapping, and in many ways these ideological zealots having to perform some sort of bow to the emperor, even if they don't like what the emperor is saying. I mean, this is how I read at least the speech in the Knesset on the one hand. And the same applies to the ceasefire, the Sharm el-Sheikh summit, where all these Arab presidents and Arab, leaders, alongside with European leaders, and coming in, and we saw the performativity of Trump and what he gets away with his non-diplomatic diplomacy that makes fun of different leaders, speaks of the German chancellor as this tall guy, hits on the Italian prime minister Giorgia Meloni. Like there's all of that theatrics that are going on, and it applies. I mean, and he's trying to say we're the center, we're the ones that give orders, we're the ones that are in the front, and you will all have to perform and clap, and not point out that the emperor has no clothes. So you'll all have to take whatever I do seriously. So there's something about that power that Trump brings in that is, first of all, absurd. It's sometimes funny. But I think what was interesting to me, the extent to which, even when he spoke to Miriam Adelson, for instance, oh, now I'm going to get her in trouble because she's Israel first. Like that type of, America first, Israel first conversation is making it into the White House, and actually, making it into Trump's mind about how he needs to navigate his own relationship to his base in the coming months. As he, I think, witnessed alongside a lot of his aides, this growing right-wing rebellion within Republican ranks against, Israel, or against the perception that Israel is leading American foreign policy. Let's put it that way. And Israel is leading also, controlling the Congress, and all of the things that are coming forth in a lot of the right-wing media, and of course, among many young right-wing Republicans as well. So I think these are like the slips that tells you that there's some sort of shift there, and it's something that we should take seriously. But of course, I think the other element, Jared, is that when it comes to Trump and Jared Kushner, Jared, his son-in-law, has this Zionist ideology. Trump has the business part, and actually the 20 point plan is one that also leaves open the question of who will reconstruct Gaza. What form of reconstruction will be actually be paved for the people of Gaza? Will the people of Gaza benefit from the process of reconstruction, meaning that they will be the one reconstructing, or whether there will be a rearrangement of, for example, land ownership to create, new spaces, new forms of living, different type of city. I mean, when we talk about the destruction of Gaza, it doesn't mean that also the rebuilding of Gaza will make Gaza look the same as before, but also it means that you can also now play with various things that have restricted in the past. For instance, creating big, I don't know, large projects, housing projects, because of land ownership. There's a lot of, there's a lot of elements that go into this and a lot of technical details. I don't want to go into it, but I think one of the problems that we have, at least facing us now as Palestinians, is that there's also a lot of interest from a lot of countries and governments and all that they want to have a role or share in the slice and pie of rebuilding Gaza and reconstructing it, including the right wing settlement project, like people like Jared Kushner, people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, who thought of the reconstruction of Gaza as a reconstruction of a new Gaza without the Gazans, without the Palestinians in Gaza. So this is all still, Jared, open up. It's still nothing is clear on that front. What we can say in terms of facts on the ground at this current moment is Israel's has gotten its prisoners back at the same time, or most of its prisoners back, and at the same time, the Palestinian resistance have not surrendered. And we've gotten also some of our prisoners back. And there's a tenuous agreement in place that could at any moment fall out, specifically if the Americans give the green light again. And at the same time, the war could also move from Gaza to the wider region at any point. So the threat of war is still there. And what we can say is also the Palestinian resistance did not surrender. It's continuing to maneuver within the available space for itself. It's trying to create the conditions for its continuation, its capacity to resist, and it's trying to also it's also trying to create the conditions for its persistence, even in the case of a more permanent form of arrangement arising in any negotiations that are taking place at this current moment.
Yeah, thank you. So, Dr. Susan, thank you for the super chat. So the question is for you, Abdaljawad. Do you think the reconstruction of Gaza is an economic trap via the IMF or Abraham Accords or the Abraham Accords, especially through the UAE? I guess I would add to that also, like, what do you think about the role of Qatar, at this point? I mean, I think one of the interesting things that came out the other day is that they're building an Air Force base for Qatar in Idaho, which is like, I mean, I don't know if people know Idaho that well, but it's kind of the funniest thing in the world, because if there's a state in the United States that would be most likely to have a white settler secession from the Union, it's probably Idaho. And the idea that there'd be, an Air Force base for Qatari jets there is kind of, ironic, I guess. But what do you think in terms of these roles of the Gulf states in the reconstruction? I mean, obviously, there's a lot to be revealed, as well as this idea of it being some kind of IMF trap or debt trap, I guess, for Palestinians.
I mean, I don't think. Look, I'm not worried about that debt traps in our context, because I think that it's much easier to destroy our economy without the debt trap, even because we have a piracy trap, for instance. Our taxes, custom taxes, are all, for example, gathered by Israel, and they don't transfer it, so they steal it. So there's easier ways to destroy our economy without the need of complex IMF debt packages that exist elsewhere. Although on that front, it's just also important to note that Palestine has been a laboratory for a lot of the things that IMF does elsewhere in terms of economic policies and their testing. also the World Bank and other. And I think Gaza would provision at least these organizations, these international organizations, but also I think new forms of think tanks and policy prescriptions that are coming outside of the Bretton Woods system. Thinking, like people like Tony Blair, people like the Boston Consultancy Group. They're thinking in a different light. They're thinking, okay, we have now an opportunity to start from scratch, destroy the Ottoman, for example, land laws that exists in Palestine, reformulate Gaza around a different conception of, for example, property rights, and create the space for whatever Trump's Riviera means, with Trump actually business interests also in the middle of it. This also pertains to perhaps still plans among the Israelis for actual settlements in the Gaza Strip, specifically in the southern area of where Rafah is, and specifically in areas where it still will hold, that Israel might actually construct real settlements, even if the Palestinians remain in the Gaza Strip. And therefore, there will be business interest from Zionists across the world, including people like Jared Kushner and the Trump, for example, real estate companies, to actually be part of this kind of profit-making enterprise. So we still don't know, at least, what is actually being prepared for Gaza in terms of reconstruction. Having said that, I think also the negotiations currently being held includes different parties. For example, Turkey all of a sudden emerged as a broker and as somebody that is interested and invested in the end of the war, despite the fact that for the past 2 years it hasn't really involved itself very heavily in negotiations or mediations, and kept that role for Qatar, which is one of its closest partners in the region, of course. But it emerged because I think also when it saw that there's something moving towards the end of the war, I think the Turks wanted a stake in perhaps also the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, at least that's part of it, but also wanted to, of course, flaunt their role to their own population, despite their close relationship, economic and diplomatic, with Israel that continued beyond the hubris of what Erdogan would say in public, but in actual reality, still supply Israel with much of its needs in many economic domains, including, of course, vegetables and iron and other important elements, some of which actually go directly to the war effort in the Gaza Strip and in the region more broadly. So we saw, for instance, the involvement of Turkey in this mediation effort. I think on the Arab government level, I mean, each Emirates is different from Qatar. Qatar is different from Saudi Arabia. The Qataris have always felt an insecurity around their own existence, because basically they were actually supposed to be part of the United Arab Emirates when the United Arab Emirates, basically had this flag independence moment in 1971 or two. But they separated. That's one element of it. The second element is that because they're a small country close to Saudi Arabia and could be easily swallowed up by Saudi Arabia. And the third element is because despite the smallness that they have, they've also found a huge reserve of natural gas that is shared by Iran. So they're like this small country in the midst of a sea of bigger countries with economic resources that are actually significant. So the Qataris basically, they created a strategy where they wanted to create at least more relevancy as mediators, as a soft power in terms of media and ability to actually recruit and work with intellectuals and culture. And these are the areas that they've carved a very large space for, spending millions in terms of soft power making because of the lack of hard power, and to try to play a much more outsized role than their actual role. And in that sense, their relationship with Hamas or the Taliban or others is one sanctioned by the US and even by Israel. Everybody knows that how the bags, for instance, of money used to reach Hamas through the air checkpoint, the Israeli checkpoint that separates Gaza from the envelope of settlements that surround Gaza. So the Israelis also sanctioned this, and they wanted the Qataris to play that role for the longest of period, and that's why the Qataris felt this tinge of betrayal when, in fact, the Hamas leadership was targeted inside Doha. They felt we were doing basically a favor to the Americans, and at the same time also doing a favor to the Israelis with an open line of communication and perhaps what they considered mutual respect, only to discover themselves in this current moment that they are only useful as long as the Americans and Israelis think that they are useful, and they could be also easily targeted and even threatened at any particular point where Benjamin Netanyahu or Trump think it's suitable. So I think that was a wake-up call for a lot of the Arab Gulf countries that, the Americans, are they reliable partners? They're unexpected. Will they go along with this, neurotic Israel that is crossing every boundary and transgressing every norm? And at the same time, to what extent they will actually permit the Americans the remaking of the region, not only in relation to the resistance axis that includes people like Hezbollah, for instance, and the Yemeni armed forces, Ansar Allah, or Iran, for that matter, but also remake the region on the expense of their allies of America and actual countries that have peace agreements with Israel, including places like Egypt, Jordan, and the Gulf countries. And I think this is, when the Israelis hit Qatar, this was a signal of the possibility that the transgression of norms will actually harm the very foundations of this Pax Americana that the region lives under. And here I mean those spaces that are capitalist, hyper-consumerist, places like Emirates, that Saudi Arabia, Qatar, that have a first world income, that actually have better, if you want, conditions of life even than the ones that exist, for example, in the United States. These like mini Emirates, capitalism, oil, and of course, foreign labor, or even if not always labor, we can also call it a form of modern form of slavery in many instances, specifically for low-skilled labor that comes into the Gulf and works through this what is called the kafala system. So these kind of spaces, these economic spaces tied to the empire in many ways, felt the stinge of threat. And I think a threat from Israel on the one hand, but also a threat more from the Americans, because I think for many in the region, they don't really separate America from Israel, rightfully so, because they look the same, they sound the same, and of course they bark in the same rhythm. And at the same time, they do think that at the end of the day, Israel could be leashed by the US, which is true. And at the same time, they do think that also Israel has influence over the US, which is also in many ways true. So they looked at this scenario and they were scared. I mean, what would happen if you throw 5 or 6 million Palestinians outside of Palestine and you manage to do that? Let's assume that you're successful, and that the Egyptians will have a problem, the Jordanians will have a problem, the Arab world will have a problem more broadly, because also the Palestinians are not necessarily, if they leave, they're not necessarily going to just integrate that easily to the countries that they go to, not because they don't want to integrate, but because there will be a lot of problems around what forms of politics will emerge from the Palestinian communities. But at the same time, just the sheer number of people, the sheer resources that need to be expended. But more importantly, it does mean that any decisive end on the Palestinian question, where the Palestinians are in the front line, actually protecting much of the borders and much of the peoples of the region, by not permitting Israel, or not or keeping Israel in a state of impasse with the Palestinians, so that places like Syria, Lebanon, and other places remain outside of the domain, at least, of the current Israeli interest for colonization and settlement. And of course, that in the long term could change, specifically with demographic shifts and changes, etc. So I know I went into this kind of various, spiraled here and there, but to come back to the question of whether there's a trap, I think the problem is that it's not necessarily a trap. The problem is that How do you end the war? This is the Palestinian perspective. How do we end the war, end the genocide, and at the same time preserve resistance? This is the challenge. This is the challenge that Hamas will have. No? Do I relinquish governance and allow, for example, another armed forces inside Gaza? Do I relinquish governance but don't allow an armed force inside Gaza? What will be actually possible? What can I actually, make or make as a fact on the ground, and what will propel, the Americans to give Israelis green light to continue with the war? And it's a question because it's an this is the challenge from the Palestinian perspective, how to guarantee continuation of the resistance movement in the Gaza Strip, reconstruction, and the stopping of massacres and the withdrawal of the Israelis. This is the goals. The Palestinian goals currently now are revolving around this. Is there a space coming out of these 2 years of genocide for an actual political grammar to emerge that is beyond necessarily humanitarian entry of food and water and electricity into the Gaza Strip? Or are we only now speaking of arrangements for Gaza because we don't want to actually open the real question, the source of all the evil, which is, the need to dismantle the apartheid regime from the river to the sea? So this is I think fundamental, and this is why it's also fundamental, Jared, that we don't see this as the end of the war because now we're seeing less harrowing images. So this kind of visceral images. Okay, we're all relieved that at least now. I mean, it sounds ridiculous that we're saying this, but now that not 100 people are killed, maybe five. Like that's the context of going from a very harrowing evil situation to a very harrowing evil situation, but less intense. But the question is that this is why it's fundamental now that we understand that for those interested in the question of Palestine and interested that the work not only continues, the pressure not only needs to continue, because I do see that some elements of the fruit of the ceasefire has to do with the pressure that has been applied. Like, of course, it took time, but it has to do with some pressure that it was applied, with the breakdown in Israel's centrality in the U.S., with the rebellion in the Democratic and, of course, Republican parties, with the rise of people like Zohran Mamdani, not because of Zohran Mamdani himself, but for what Mamdani represents and embodies in terms of a shift in politics, for the shift that we're seeing in the right wing, also in the U.S., but also in Europe, and also in labor unions in Italy that organize massive strikes, for what was going on also in terms of shift in some of the policies like recognition, etc. So there was growing pressure on Israel. Israel felt it. Otherwise, Netanyahu would not say super Sparta, no, that we're moving towards this embrace of isolation. And at the same time, I think the Americans have decided that it's time to bring this into some sort of closure. But they want to close this without actually creating the conditions for a radical change that goes to the root of problem, which means the de-radicalization of Israeli society, the de-Zionification of Israeli society, the disarmament of Israel and its continuation and perpetual mode of war. These are the things that need to be slowly but assuredly actually advanced within the domain of any movement in Palestine, because these are the goals that will actually achieve some sort of justice and, of course, freedom and dignity for peoples in Palestine, but also beyond.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I appreciate you, bringing in, the role of global resistance, which I think, as you said, it took quite a while for it to build up to where it got to. Is a slow build, and I think it's really important. I agree with you that people not, not accept this as a win or an endpoint or, some reason to demobilize around those movements, but actually an opportunity to, advance even stronger demands and campaigns. And somebody brought up that despite this peace deal, in quotes, people in Barcelona are protesting towards the Israeli consulate. Some fires were started. I guess that happened today. But yeah, I mean, obviously, we've seen the role of Spain and the role of labor movement, Palestinian movement in Italy. There was also obviously the plan proposed by Gustavo Petro at the UN, which is not the one, of course, that everybody got behind, but at least proposing an alternative that included, an armed force basically deploying to confront Israel, right? And so I think it's important that people keep pushing that envelope. Yeah, somebody brought in this. I'm going to have people in my administration who are Zionists, which was a recent quote from Zoran Mamdani. And I will say this: I know that you have talked about what his campaign kind of represents for you, but a lot of folks in the States, myself included, are quite, just feel ultimately like it's 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 a dead end, and that he's becoming more and more favorable to Zionists by the day, and that if he does get elected, that will be the way that he governs. But I understand the kind of feeling that you have around the space that he opened up within American politics for a brief period of time. I think largely that's been closed already, though.
No,
You
but
want to say something?
I don't think he opened up a space. I think Palestine opened up the space for him to become a leading contender. So I'm not grateful for Mamdani. He should be grateful for Palestine, of course. And he's, as you said, I mean, even the article that I wrote, I said, the logic of occupation will start. He will start to feel the pressure. People will start demanding of him new positions, and we'll see where he ends up. From that moment. But I think Mamdani is actually a symptom of what Palestine offered, not him himself opening up or carving the space. I don't think he carved the space for us. I think we carved the space, not mean Palestinians, but Palestine as a movement, Palestine as something that resonated with people, Palestine as it opened the space for him. So yeah, I mean, just to clarify
No,
that. Yeah.
no, I think that's an important distinction. All right. Let's see. So the other thing, well, I want to talk a little bit about the prisoner exchanges. I mean, as you said, they're not, perhaps what Palestinians had hoped for in terms of this, and obviously, not a lot is what Palestinians had hoped for in the last couple of years, but still seemed quite significant and powerful in certain ways. Obviously, through them also revealed more, which, not that it needs to be revealed at this point, but the barbarity and the kind of torture, and even, I mean, some quite awful things. I mean, just people who thought that their family members had been killed, and in some cases had been told that they had been killed. I heard one instance where, and I just heard this. I can't verify it, but that Palestinian family had been given a body, or a set of, a body to bury, telling them that it was their child or whatever, and then their child was released in the prisoner exchange. And so they, in some cases, families learning that loved ones that they had already, um, you know, mourned, I know is not the right word, given what you've talked about with Palestine and mourning, but had already assumed had been killed, or had been told had been killed, were actually still alive. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have thoughts on the exchanges themselves and anything that you found really significant within them.
I mean, of course, I mean, the first significant element of the exchange is that much of the leadership of the Palestinian national movement were excluded. That included people like Ahmad Saadat, who's the head of the PFLP, Palestine Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Marwan Barghouti, who's one of the leading figures within the Fatah movement, and at the same time, people like Ibrahim Hamid and others, even within Hamas's ranks, who hold a special and unique position of leadership, but also history and resistance in the West Bank or beyond. So the agreement, excluded a lot of these leaders. Some of them are, activists or people who had a long history of resistance, specifically in the Second Intifada. And I think that that was a disappointment for many, that we could not reach a better agreement that would actually see the release not only of the leaders, but also of all the long sentences and people who have life sentences on them. So that leaves also the question of prisoners and prison releases in the future, of course, open, which means that this file will continue to play an important role in Palestinian life on a daily basis, of course, but also in the coming months and years. That's one element, at least, of the prisoners exchange agreement that was quite disappointing. But of course, at the same time, I think everybody is in relief that at least if this means an end of the war and the pain and the massacres, then it's something that the Palestinians are willing to swallow at this current moment. So that's one element. The second, I think, element about the prisoners exchange is the extent to which the prison has changed itself. So now there's a second struggle, is that since October 7th, the prison, which was already horrific, has become a hellscape where food is non-existent, where people are tortured and humiliated daily, even told things that are lied to, tortured psychologically, humiliated, made to bark. I mean, the stories that are coming out from these torture chambers are basically highly harrowing. And we saw, of course, Ben Gvir going to Marwan Barghouti's cell, or the beating of leaders, or their humiliation, or how people are coming out, having losing 20 kilograms or 30 kilograms of their body mass, having problems with their, coming out with a lot of different diseases, coming out with problem with malnutrition, which is not easily, has, permanent damage on them. So there's a problem, there's an actual struggle. And nobody wants to enhance the conditions of prison because we want the end of imprisonment itself and incarceration. But there's going to be an actual struggle in the coming future for prison to at least be more, of course, it's never dignified, but has more dignity in it. That's one element of the struggle. This is a struggle that will need to be led by the prisoners, but also with those in the global movement, of course, in the hope of abolishing imprisonment and incarceration as a whole. This is one element of also the prison exchange. The idea that these prisoners are coming out in the conditions that they're coming out, it means that there is no self-respecting national movement that would permit this to remain for the long term as a condition for its own people living the most harrowing experiences within the confinement of prison. So this is something that is actually still not necessarily on the primary, or let's say on the head of the agenda, just because of the conditions of Gaza itself and how harrowing it is. But I can see if actually Gaza moves into some sort of arrangement, reconstruction, etc., then the prisoners issue will become one of the central issues, at least for us in Palestine. It'll be one of the issues that we'll keep sustaining as a rallying cry, and one that we'll put forward for the world as something that needs a solution. Of course, abolishment is part of that, but at the same time, at least some sort of more dignified conditions for imprisonment for the Palestinian prisoners currently in prison. So this is one element, at least, of the exchange agreement. The other thing I think what is interesting is that the exclusion of leaders from the list is that you can see a colonial anxiety, not only in rewarding the Palestinians with the release of important names and central and symbolic figures, but also of an anxiety that exists among Israelis of the possibility and specter of Palestinian unity that actually would be a strategic shift on the part of the Palestinians. And it tells us there is a challenge here. There's a challenge to get rid of those Palestinian forces that are preventing a form of unity based on national principles, and hereby which I mean the Palestinian Authority. because they're the ones that are actually uninterested in solving the Palestinian division, because they're interested in still maintaining this economic status where they extract money, make accumulate capital on the expense of the Palestinian people, while sustaining their relationship with Israel on the basis of security coordination. So this is one of the elements that I think is central of how these leaders, like Ahmed Saadat, like Marwan Barghouti, and others within the prison, also within Hamas, can forge some sort of new road ahead from the left wing of Palestine, from the nationalist movements of Fatah, but also from the Islamic revivalist groups represented by Hamas and Islamic Jihad, and move towards a much more unified paradigm in terms of their political goals and objectives, and creating conditions for some sort of, I wouldn't say organizational unity, but at least some more unity. And this is the fear now, of course, in the coming months. And to what extent we will see Hamas moves towards the current paradigm of Fatah, or vice versa, or they will remain separated by one fixating on the strategy of cooperation, the other fixating on the strategy of resistance. So within the the insistence, the Israeli insistence on not releasing some of these leaders is not only because of it's a political strategic question that these leaders might play some sort of positive role in, of course, the forging ahead of some sort of new paradigm, or challenging existing forces enough. Somebody like Marwan Barghouti might be able to launch a challenge against the current PA leadership in a way that would make it will threaten the paradigm that has existed for a long time. Although I doubt it, because this paradigm that exists in the West Bank is reinforced through the bureaucracy, the payment, the material need for survival, and all of these different things. But at least he does stand as a figure that has the capacity to conduct that. So that's also an interesting paradigm of, if you want, of the prisoners exchange agreement, Israeli insistence on the non-release of some of these leaders and some of the prisoners that are involved on the political side of things, mostly, rather than actually the militant side of things, in a nutshell. So yeah, I mean, this is what it comes to the Palestinian. This is the issue that comes to the exchange. It leaves it open, the horroring of prisoners' experiences now in prison, the need for abolishment, and of course, at least the enhancement of conditions. And the third, what the exclusion of leadership actually tells us.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, I think that goes into kind of where I want to go next, which is to talk a little bit about the question of disarmament, right? Which I know that I mean, Hamas, even in their acceptance, right? This letter that Trump tweeted out, which talked about the inalienable rights of Palestinian self-determination, basically, which people found quite humorous that Trump would put something out like that publicly. But that, at least all the statements that I've seen have suggested from Hamas and from the other factions that they do not intend to disarm. But also, that seems to be one of the pieces that becomes part of what phase two of this, loose ceasefire agreement is about. And so I think there's a lot of questions. I mean, I think Hamas has said something along the lines of, they would hand over their weapons to a Palestinian national body, basically, but they would not relinquish the right to arms and to self-defense and, all of those things, which are the right of all peoples. And so, where do you think, what are you seeing, I guess, in terms of some of the discussions about what that might look like, or how, you know, I guess maybe the big questions that the resistance has to, grapple with, as well as what Israel has to grapple with, because on some level, I mean, obviously Trump said the other thing, the thing the other day about if they don't disarm, we will disarm them. But then the question becomes, well, how is that going to be effectuated? And so, yeah, there's a lot of questions, I think, around that.
I mean, look, I think when it comes again to this armament as placed in the agreement, this is one of these issues, whether in Lebanon or in Gaza. There's this demand for disarmament. There's an arrangement that speaks of disarmament in the agreement, but at the same time, that in reality, the forces that are meant to disarm reject it. So this is a paradigm that will continue. Now, whether resistance forces move towards disarmament, it means that they cease to be resistance forces. Like it is a historic shift. It means that it's an annunciation of a new, completely new Hamas, one that will probably resemble an echo. And this goes back to the earlier part, that will resemble an echo, something like Fateh. It's basically a surrender, and not only a surrender, but one that transforms them into stakeholders in whatever arrangement they will find within the new order that will come, instead of being those trying to press against that order to create a new world. They'll just like find a space within the order itself. This is the question, because I don't see necessarily that the resistance in Gaza will go down that route. And in many ways, it does permit Israel also, I think, what will be presented as the legitimacy to continue to act in Gaza, but not necessarily in the same way that it acted before, which is the same thing that we have seen happening in Lebanon. So this is the paradigm. It's sometimes you're placing things in the agreement, not necessarily out of reaching that goal now, but in provisioning the legitimacy for your ally, in this context, Israel, to sustain a military campaign of, for instance, assassination or some bombings in the future based on that agreement. Now, the second element, I think, just to correct you, Jared, is that Hamas never said it will give it to a Palestinian body. It said it will give it to the forces of the Palestinian state, so that it will only disarm once this whole paradigm of, for instance, a two-state solution arises, which means Hamas is saying, I will only give up the weapons when the conditions for using weapons have ceased to exist. So this is what it's. So if you want me to give up my weapons, you will need to create a Palestinian state on, for instance, the 1967 borders or whatever Hamas envisions or thinks. So just like to correct that element. And the third thing around disarmament is that, yeah, it does keep the possibility that Israel will move back to war open. Same with Lebanon, and again, even same with Iran. So we're in this moment where things are still trembling, and within the agreements that are signed, there's no real finality or closure, because those who Israel has attacked have not really been defeated in the total sense of the word. And at the same time, Israel has not necessarily been able to meet all of its objectives in vis-a-vis these actors as it intended to. So we're in that kind of flux position. So I think disarmament is very far away from the table. Of course, much of the fears that are currently existing within Palestinian political analyst communities and people are thinking politically is to what extent the introduction of an Arab force, if that will happen and move forward, or a Turkish force within the Gaza Strip, will be a buffer between the Palestinians and Israel, or will be the start of a process of demilitarization and disarmament, not through the Israeli forces themselves, but through the threat of clashes with other powers that might create a problem for the Palestinians. And this is one of the things that we should also understand. This is actually why, for instance, places like Jenin camp, where not, I wouldn't say easily defeated, but easily cleared, is that once the PA entered the scene, it became harder to also conduct a war with those forces, the Palestinian forces and the resistance forces, trying to prevent the descending into a civil war. But what I mean by it, perhaps I didn't frame it correctly here, is that an Arab force Egyptians or Turks or I don't know, Arab forces coming from across the region, and then engaging in any form of disarmament and actual weapons on the ground and confronting the resistance will be uh, quite a problematic issue for the resistance itself to actually engage with, whether it's in the relationship to other Arab countries, whether it's in diplomatic legitimacy, whether, it will create a lot of problems. So the fear is that the Arabs and the Islamic states are giving Israel what Israel cannot achieve, or are attempting to actually give Israel what Israel couldn't achieve through 2 years of bombardment and killing. So it remains a question, but we will have to see to what extent actually the round of negotiations continue, to what extent Israel and the Palestinians, mediated through Arab countries and Arab guarantees, and of course American guarantees, will reach some sort of arrangement that is much more permanent, or to what extent the threat or the use of violence will be the primary mode through which negotiations will take place, and therefore the descent towards war might happen at any moment. So again, this remains an open question. It's the same in Lebanon. It's the same even in relation to Iran, and even in relation to Yemen as well.
Yeah, thank you. So someone asked if you could speak to how Gaza families purportedly finally stood aside from protecting, ignoring Abu Shabab, why they ignored him, what changed. Yeah, I mean, I guess this also comes to the wider question of the resistance kind of reestablishing, internal security within the strip, which has included, also, as you talked about earlier on, holding to account some of the gangs. I also saw like some of the money changers that were charging exorbitant rates for, to withdraw funds and things like this. So yeah, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, I'm not sure what the question is asking, um, but I'll try my best to
I think
answer.
it was something along the lines of, I guess, why did Abu Shabab's whatever support they had within Palestine, which I'm not sure that they had much within among Gazans. But yeah.
I mean, I never I don't like, although I'm not the most well versed in Gaza local politics because I'm not from Gaza, but the gangs that have risen they take different shapes and forms. Some are tied to some families, others are not. They're like a collection of, if you want, uh, uh, you know, um, people who are on the margins, or thieves, or drug smuggling, or even takfiris, like people from ideological background closer to ISIS, etc. Um, I didn't, but most of these gangs, because first of all, they tied themselves not only to the Israeli war machine, but they were also not acting in a way that actually builds legitimacy, because they were robbing from people, not giving to the people. They were extorting people with higher prices and selling goods on the market in a high, overpriced manner. So the idea that they had or have any form of legitimacy, or they compete with the resistance forces, is not necessarily not only out of like a nationalist political stance. It's just simply because they acted like common thieves that robbed people, killed people, exploited people in time of need, and at the same time cooperated with Israel. So their paradigm of cooperation is not one, oh, I can service you, or I can provision you with food. Of course, maybe the Israelis attracted some of them based on that, but they were the ones stealing the trucks. They're the ones so they were the ones that were stealing the trucks, taking the food from the trucks, and then selling it in the market in higher prices. They're the ones that were robbing even houses in the Gaza Strip, because people, when they left, they're the ones that had, and they also put their hands with Israel. Because I mean, again, I mean, if you don't, forms of cooperation that works, at least they need to actually start competing in the provisioning of service, and actually coming out and figuring out as an alternative to whatever governance or competing political structure that exists. And these gangs don't have any, and therefore they don't have much legitimacy. Sometimes they have a hardcore group, an area, a neighborhood. And maybe they're tied to the name of a family, although the whole family is not necessarily involved in it. But in general, they didn't really pose a real threat on being an alternative to the Palestinian resistance in the Gaza Strip, because they acted in ways that made them more and more hated by the people, rather than actually provisioning any form of winning hearts and minds. Because I don't think their role in Israeli mindset was to compete and overcome Hamas. Their role was to actually uh, be saboteurs, to be informants, and at the same time to create some condition for infighting, but at the same time without any necessarily real project for replacing the Palestinian resistance with these gangs themselves. Maybe in the long term, that's what they're thinking, but the way they're used in their function were to actually reinforce Israel's form of genocide by, oh, we allowed the trucks in, but the Palestinians stole it. Who are the Palestinians that stole it? Of course, it's the Israeli financed and sponsored gangs. That Israel would tell the truck is coming from here, go steal it. So the way through which these gangs operated and the way through which Israel also used that operation was actually intended towards the elimination and impoverishment of the Palestinian society. So it wasn't really meant as an alternative form of power arrangement or governance structure, rather than as a way of disrupting even the very mechanisms that Israel had to adhere with or to adhere to in order to continue the war, meaning not really making people hungry, for instance. So, they created the GHF and then also this kind of gang infrastructure in that sense. So I don't see them as a threat. I never saw them as a threat in that sense because of the way they were used and the function that they had, and at the same time because they also came from bad reputations as people. And Abu Shabab had a bad reputation. He was in prison. He's a drug smuggler, at least that's the rumors. But there was no real basis for these gangs to be able to actually control the Gaza Strip. One of the things that we also need to understand about Palestinian society, just generally, although these generalizations are always wrong, is that the only form of real cooperation that worked is the one that was based on nationalist history. So even in betraying Palestine, it still needs to kind of carry a heavy load of the theatrics of nationalism at the same time, and still needs to be able to also provision a lot of services and money and build its legitimacy through the day-to-day management of life. So when you have these two things absent, this phenomena basically lives and dies by Israeli presence. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, appreciated. All right, one more question from Francis. Do you have a sense of Axis of Resistance's analysis of the roles of China, Russia in relation to Palestine right now? Have these realities affected Palestinian resistance response to U.S.-Israeli plans?
I mean, it's a big question because I think you're bringing in two geopolitical players. Russia, for instance, to me at least, and a lot of people might find this controversial, but I never thought of Russia as, I think the Russian political elite has always had a very Zionist bias. They are highly invested also in Israel in many ways. Some of it is also cultural affinity that much of also, let's say, the Ashkenazi Jews, a lot of them also come from Russia or from the area Russia thinks it should dominate. Let's put it that way, Central Europe, etc. So there's that kind of cultural affinity. We should remember that one of the earliest states to actually recognize Israel is the Soviet Union, and at the same time, that Czechoslovakia under the Soviet Union played an important role in actually saving Israel in 1948 by selling weapons. And the Russians have that legacy that continues to this day. And we can see it even in the way they have built a relationship with Iran, and what forms of weapons they actually provision to the Iranians and what forms of weapons they're actually denying the Iranians. Part of that concentration has to do with not breaking the balance between Israel and the Iranians. So while in some ways Russia benefited from the war in our region because it enabled it to divert resources from the front in Ukraine. The West became much more interested in what's happening in Israel. Factories and the industrial bases working overnight to create all these weapons had to now contend with two major wars that our Western allies, between quotes, are now fighting. It did weaken a bit the Ukrainian position. So it diverted attention from the war into Ukraine to the one in Palestine. So the Russians benefited from it. They received Hamas in the beginning. They were eager to still speak, and they still have that pragmatism of speaking to all the partners and parties. But I don't think the Russian position really figures here as central. That's all I'm saying, because also Russia has lost, at least in the past year, as one of the disadvantages of this war, its position in Syria. So, I mean, or at least is losing its position in Syria as it tries to conduct negotiations with the new government to maintain its bases in Syria. So the Russians have lost some leverage in the region, and at the same time, I'm not sure to what extent they're willing to actually back the axis of resistance in a meaningful way, and in a way that actually provisions or helps the axis of resistance overcome some of the Western air superiority that we have seen, so fundamental to the successes that Israelis have had in the past couple of 2 years, specifically in Lebanon and in Iran. So I'm not sure that, although the Russians have weapons that could actually help, I'm not sure to what extent they were willing to extend them or really truly help its allies, between quotes, or its other partners in the region, including Iran and the rest. As for China, I mean, I'm not. There are rumors that China tried to play the role in all of this, and that, but I'm not sure what the Chinese have done or haven't done. We can. The only thing that I would say that is the Chinese have had an invested interest in the sustainment of the opening of the Strait of Hormuz, which also figured in the Iranian decision not to close it in the 12-day war. It remained as a leverage point, of course, for the Iranians because they could close it, but that will also harm the supply of oil to places like China as well as to Europe and other places. So, but I'm not sure to what extent the Chinese are truly moving into the region in a way that in which they want to enunciate themselves as a real global power that could provision, for example, I don't know, a military protection. One of the interesting things that have happened is this agreement between Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, through which Pakistan and Saudi Arabia have a mutual defense agreement that principally applies also to the use of nuclear weapons. Maybe a bit directed towards Iran, maybe a bit directed towards Israel, maybe it's just a reassurance or the creating of reassurance, knowing too well that also Pakistan in many ways is a country that now has very tight and close relationships with China. And of course, a lot of its weapon system, a lot of the weaponry it has and possesses come also from the Chinese. So we can see maybe that the Chinese are trying to slowly come into the region through, for example, its principal Muslim Islamic partner, which is the Pakistanis. And to some extent, the Saudis are receptive to that, which tells us also something about the shift among some of the ruling elites in the Gulf, where we need to hedge more and not completely and principally place ourselves completely in the American domain. And this Pakistan solution of conducting a mutual defense agreement in this way with the Pakistani government provisions a way through which Pakistan and China also figure in Saudi security, not only the United States of America. So there are these moves. They're subtle. They're still nuanced. But I don't think that Russia and China played such a central role in the creation for the conditions of the ceasefire. The name of the game until today is still America, Israel, and resistance forces. This has been the name of the game for the past couple of years. Russia is too bogged down in its own war and its own problems to really play an active role, elsewhere. So this is one of the, if you want, the advantages of the war in Ukraine, at least from the perspective of the Americans, is one of the principal elements of, Russian power, is that it's slowly shrinking because of this focus on the Ukrainian war. And the second thing, China is still moving quietly and doesn't want to really anger anybody, at least in the region, trying to build economic interests, trying to slowly weave itself through, it's the need for oil, for instance, what it can provision some of these countries. But the Chinese are not necessarily, until now, playing an active, principled role, or even, a moral role. I think they liked the fact that the Americans are, lost a lot of soft power. We're embarrassed by what's happening in Palestine. A lot of the powers that are contending with the Americans, saw in this a moment where they could also, attack American political and moral and ethical claims, and all that comes around it, because they hear all these lectures from Western governments all the time, and now Gaza is like the counter example that can be placed in front of their eyes on what the Western powers and Western imperialism is capable of doing, by supporting one of its principal allies, Israel. But I don't think it figured really in the provisioning of this text. I do think that the moment, this Gaza moment, is opening a space a bit for the, for more powers, for governments, for example, Gulf governments, to think of arrangements beyond the US, to hedge their own security domain outside of only American protection, military protection.
Yeah, thank you for that. Um, I think we kind of can wind down. Are there any things over the next couple of weeks that you think folks should really keep an eye on? I know you recommended people keep the pressure up. I've also been seeing a lot of folks in Gaza talking about how there's still a tremendous need for them for receipt of resources, basically, because you know still not enough aid is getting in, but even aid is not mean getting housing or an ability to rebuild for their families or things like this. And so, yeah, what are your thoughts on kind of the coming period here?
I mean, yeah, I think still, we're not in any ways out of, uh, Gaza is still in ruins. People have no access to electricity, water, food in a meaningful sense. Yes, the prices came down, but there's still a lot of problems on each front in Gaza, beyond the extent to which people have lost loved ones and their homes and houses, and the picture doesn't really look that great. I mean, the future looks still very bleak, and I would say that, if 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 we turn away at this critical moment from Palestine, the logic of inhalation will only go one step further in the coming future. Doesn't mean in the next weeks, but it will only go one step further. It will move from the destruction of city and daily massacres to the total annihilation of people if you cannot get people out. So it's very, very important that people understand that, that the end of the war doesn't mean the end of our engagement. And I hope that doesn't happen, although I'm cynical about it. Um, because I do understand that, we're interested in a thing as long as, we see massacres every day. But the moment massacres stop, for instance, and of course they don't stop because war never really ends in Palestine, and this is something I always insist on. It takes different shapes and forms, but there's always a war. And sometimes it's only when we do something that is a bit intense, people like jump out of their beds and start, thinking what happened. But I'm very concerned that we don't learn the lesson these 2 years, is that these 2 years should not ever be repeated, not for us, not for any people in the world, and that we need to make sure that that doesn't happen. And it's really important and fundamental that people outside Palestine, but also inside Palestine. We have a lot of attacks on our hand, but also outside of Palestine, remain vigilant and remain organized and create more institutions and create the possibilities, not because of the Palestinians themselves, because, if we're reading this moment as a moment where the right wing learns what it have done wrong, if it failed, if this is the end of this current episode, then they will correct their failure later with even more intense form of violence. We cannot think of a reckoning in Israel where, you know, um, we move into a society that acknowledges that it has done genocide, and then a society that actually starts to, review itself and have a moral consciousness. I don't think that that will happen. I'm not saying no Israelis will do that, but I think most Israelis and most Israeli society will think of what is the next step in the ladder of how you inhalate a people. That's what's most likely the outcome of the assumption which I am making is that this is the end, at least, or the end in a very loose way, the end of uh, this current interval of intense massacres and destruction of the Gaza Strip. So this is the fear. The fear is that if Israel seriously does not actually pay a price, its impunity continues, its sense of not being able, nobody can touch it continues, it's not held accountable, it does not feel that there are real consequences for what it has committed on the global stage, on the moral stage, on political stage, on the diplomatic stage, whatever, wherever we can also turn people power, people consciousness to political power and pressure, whether through protest, through media, through organization, through raising the consciousness, through whatever means possible, then that's the next step. And this is why I say the future looks bleak, because whatever arrangement is created now, it's only postponing the coming war. It will not actually solve anything. It will only postpone and defer, or the countdown for the next war has already, if you want, started.
Thank you. It's a great note to leave people on. Appreciate conversations always, my friend. I know we'll do another one in a few weeks, but yeah, thank you for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you.